You may have had the idea that the Alamo Scouts is an organization of cutthroats and toughs. You will find that is not so. We want you to be tough, just as tough as you can make yourselves. But we do not have any place in the organization for a tough. This type of work does not call for bums and tramps. It calls for the highest qualities of soldiering. You will be closely observed during all of the 6 weeks you are here. If it is found that you are not mentally, temperamentally, or physically fit and up to the standards required, if it is found that you are not sincerely trying, you will be returned to your parent unit promptly the next day. The officers of the staff are here with the single thought of furnishing their best in the way of training. Training begins tomorrow. Dismiss.
Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the WRB podcast. Thank you for, stopping in and listening to us talk about the Alamo Scouts. And I'm your host, Russ Blaise, and my co-host is Lance Zedric. Lance, say hello.
Hello.
Hello. For those of you who don't know it, we live in different states in the United States. So I'm in Florida. Lance is in Illinois. So...
well, somebody's got to be. Might as well be me, right?
That's right. That's it.
You have all the nice weather there right now. It's raining outside. It was 80 degrees last week, and then the next day it got down to we had 2 inches of snow.
Oh, man. Yeah, we just had a hurricane a couple months ago, so we're still recovering from that and everything. But anyway, this episode, we're going to talk about training. Okay, the Alamo Scouts, what they went through, what it took to, be an Alamo Scout, what you had to endure during training. So, Lance, let's start off with you.
All right. Well, whenever you mentioned training, Russ, I just thought of the Bill Murray movie Stripes from 1980. It was Army training. Well,
yeah.
This was Army training, let me tell you. And just to set the scene a little bit, was it the toughest training in the Army? No. Regardless of what people say, there was tougher training out there in 1943-44 than what the Alamo Scouts had, but I don't know if there was any more specific training than perhaps the Scouts or actually the OSS in Europe has some very specific training, language and communications and such, and the 1st Special Service Force, also known as the Devil's Brigade, they had very specific, they had varied training,
and they had more airborne training. The Scouts didn't have airborne training.
Absolutely. Now they did have 2 teams of qualified airborne,
11th
candidate
Airborne
or members.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that's one of the myths, Russ. Excuse me. That's one of the myths about the Alamo Scouts, that they were an all Native American airborne unit. Well, not so. But they did have a couple teams of airborne who had airborne qualified members in them, and 2 team leaders, Roundsville and Nellis, who were airborne with the 11th Airborne Division. So getting back to training, there's a lot to go over here, but we'll try to give you the abbreviated version of the training. So in our last episode, we talked about what it took to get selected to attend the Scouts Training Center, which really consisted of a 6-week program. Now that 6 weeks included a lot of different things. So you had 8 skill areas. The first 4 weeks of that were primarily hitting a lot of the skills, and then the final 2 weeks were dedicated mostly to field problems, where you would put those newfound skills into practice in a very challenging environment. And later in the war, the the operations, the training missions would actually be conducted in lightly held enemy territory. And on one occasion, they actually encountered the enemy and had some combat.
Yeah, that was the 4th training class on Hollandia.
Absolutely, with our friend Terry Santos.
Terry Santos told me all about it. Woo, heavy duty. And the funny thing about it was they were caught off guard, coming back from a mock training mission, because basically they went out and they just took notes of the Japanese. Maybe they were unloading a boat or something like that, supplies, and they would just watch them and they would take notes and they, compass readings and all that stuff, and then come back. Well, they ran into a Jap patrol. So there was a firefight. And I think Red Williams wasn't very happy about it.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
I don't think he was happy about anything. With talking with the scouts. But and we do have a clip later on we're going to play of Red talking about some of the exacting standards that he had while director of the ASTC, because Bradshaw left in the spring after the first 2 classes when the scouts moved on to mainland New Guinea. So he was done and he went to work for G2 with 6th Army. So Homer Red Williams took over training. So if we talk about the 3 directors of training interchangeably, please forgive us. First was Bradshaw, and Frederick Bradshaw was there until May 13th of 44. And then Homer Williams took over. And then later that year, as they got into the Lady campaign, Gibson Niles, a West Pointer, took over. So those were the 3 directors of training that the Alamo Scouts Training Center had during its existence, which was essentially right around 18 months. So getting back to training, Russ, the Scouts had 8 different areas of skill training. And I'm going to go through some of these, and some are going to be more difficult than others. Some are going to be very specific to the Scouts, and others are going to be general Army skills that were enhanced through the Scouts. And at the essence of it, the core was scouting and patrolling. They were a reconnaissance and radar unit designed to collect intelligence behind the lines. And there are different ways of getting there. As you alluded to, they were not an airborne unit, although it had been discussed for a couple of the teams to drop in by parachute a couple of times, but they never were. So the first I have here is scouting, patrolling, and that included planning, selection of rations, small unit tactics, movement to contact, beach reconnaissance, cutting and crossing entanglements, bivouac, stalking, there's a negative connotation to it, boat reconnaissance, use of binoculars, reaction course, and river crossing expedients. So a lot of the things that an infantry man would undergo in basic training, but very specific to the area. Navigation, map and compass reading, direction by the sun, jungle navigation, day and night. And that's interesting because in New Guinea, a lot of the jungles were triple canopy. And some of the men said that it could be the middle of the day and you felt like it was nighttime.
Yeah, they carried flashlights with a red filter on them, so they can see sometimes.
And so there a lot of that type of navigation, scouting, patrolling, rubber boat handling, care and maintenance of they have the 6 and the 10-man rubber boats that they trained with, and it's I'd read somewhere that the Scouts were the first to use rubber boats. They were not. They had been used by other units, but that was their primary means of getting from the PT boat onto the shore of wherever it was they were reconnoitering. And this was especially valuable during the New Guinea and Lady operation. Now, not so much when they got to Luzon it was done less because, they went in with the invasion forces, so they would infiltrate different ways. But rubber boat handling included care and maintenance of the boat, handling of it, infiltration and exfiltration, day and night landings, and in-surf landings. So much like the Navy SEALs, they spent a lot of time carrying that boat and running
a lot of
with
times there was a lot of high surfs. They get dropped off by the PT boat, and they would get hit with a rough water going in and everything. So they had to learn how to handle that.
Absolutely. And incidentally, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Scouts and their record, they performed a known 110 missions behind enemy lines without losing a man killed or captured. But they did have 2 men killed in training.
Right.
And that training occurred near the Tami River on northern New Guinea in October of 1944. And they were practicing the rubber boat landing.
Yeah.
High surf, and 2 men drowned, an officer and a sergeant.
Right. Well, I was practicing landing rubber boats in the surf on Tami Beach, which was just outside of Hollandia. And a lieutenant and a sergeant were drowned during that training session. There at least one trainee that was badly wounded during a training exercise. Actually, it was range firing. He got all shot up in the stomach, survived, but he was returned to the States, evacuated.
They were quality men, but that high surf and unpredictable current there in northern New Guinea. And matter of fact, Gibson Niles said that of all the things that he had underwent in his 30-year career, that the death of those 2 men weighed probably more heavily upon him than anything for ordering.
It was done because it wasn't during a battle. It was during training.
Yeah. Now there were scouts injured. One man, I know of, one man was shot in the abdomen during training. Another man in the leg, and the normal array of cuts and broken bones and bruises and a lot of damaged egos, I'm sure, during training. Andy Smith, one of the scouts from the 4th class, would tell me that he picked a few fights with certain guys just because they were told to, and he said, I didn't really come out too well. He says, I was 6th Army's best athlete, but not on that day. He said, so that was the volleyball games. We alluded to this in the previous episode about the volleyball was always a spirited event that got the guys competing. Well, back to this, Russ. One of the core areas was survival, of course, cover and concealment, a jungle first aid, edible and non-edible foods, unarmed combat judo, knife fighting, use of native materials, and use of the jungle medical kit, which was a little different. It had different salves and medicines and such. The Scouts even had a man named Lieutenant Raymond Watson from the Royal Australian Forces who, I don't know, advantageously seemed to attach himself to the Alamo Scouts for quite some period of time as a jungle instructor. And he was quite the presence, a very big man. I had an opportunity to correspond with him. And he said, oh, I loved my time with the Scouts. He said, it was hard staying ahead of the Royal Australian Forces. They kept requesting for me to come back, and I really didn't want to leave.
In late 1943, I was given orders to join the Alamo Scouts encamped on the northeast coast of New Guinea as an instructor in jungle warfare, in particular dealing with the native populations in the area. After some months, the orders were given to the Scouts to move camp to Dutch New Guinea. I accompanied the move as I had no other instructions from my force headquarters, and I suppose that's why it claimed I took a taxi ride north. if indeed it was considered a sensible thing to do.
And to piggyback off that, while I'm thinking about it, is the Scouts would request instructors for whatever it was they needed. So 6th Army, for example, they needed a person to teach code. They would send them over. They needed a person to teach certain language skills. They would have that person sent over from 6th Army. So there was an array of experts.
Yeah, they were taught Pidgin English. Is that what I understood? Yeah, my father used to tell me that.
And as they got into, of course, they had rudimentary Japanese.
Right.
And on one account, Andy Smith told me that he'd practiced. They were doing a raid on Oranjebari in New Guinea, and he'd practiced this line about, surrender and you won't be hurt. And he said, I had it down. My Japanese was really good, and going on and on and on. And he says, we snuck in there, and he says, the guy was sleeping, and he says, I pulled back his sheet, and he says, I forgot every word of Japanese I ever knew. He says, so sometimes his Japanese, he didn't really get a chance to use it.
Yeah.
Other times Tagalog would be instructed, and certain Malay and other dialects, just a rudimentary use so they could trade and maybe get a little bit of information here and there. Communication was a biggie. The use of the radio, Morse code. Candidates had to send and receive 10 words per minute using a one-time pad, which was a little encryption type pad that would change. Later on in the Philippines, they had a dedicated 978th service signal company of native Filipinos and Filipinos from the U.S. Army that would accompany scouts in missions and assume most of the bulk of the radio transmissions to the Filipino message center. Pidgin English you'd mentioned, message writing, blinker lights, rudimentary Malay, Tagalog, and Japanese, and relations and customs with guerrillas, which is, again, another thing we're going to talk about is how the Scouts evolved from a simple reconnaissance unit into actually a unit that equipped and supplied and worked with the 1,000-man guerrilla units.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
we're actually in charge of them later on in the Philippines.
Yeah, well, and we'll get into a mission, OMOC mission, my father was on. I believe it was a Sumner team, and they used to set up radio depots throughout the Philippines and keep an eye on the Japanese, the roads. They were like on road patrol. They would count the Japanese as they would go by and stuff like that. Didn't sound exciting, but it was an important job of the Alamo Scouts. It was part of it.
And I bet it got the blood pressure up a little bit too when somebody walks by you 3 feet away. And,
oh yeah,
and you're behind their lines. Andy Smith from the 4th class told me, he says, I did behind the lines reconnaissance in 3 wars. And he said, I was in the Ho Chi Minh Trail on the side I wasn't supposed to be, and the guys were 3 feet from me. And he says, somebody had to count those dudes. Ugh. So, again, a special kind of soldier. And we had weapons training, carbine, 60-millimeter mortar, grenade throwing, submachine gun, pistol, explosives, snares and booby traps, Japanese weapons training, sniper course, the garrote, how to take somebody out with using a garrote, or in their case, many of them they trained with tent stakes. How to approach a sentry from behind and with a tent stake.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, what every soldier loves, conditioning, which included lots of swimming, lots of calisthenics, and lots of marching up and down mountains. The Scouts had there in the first 2 classes, they had a mountain and a 26-mile jungle hike. at the conclusion of their training, which, if you've been on those, I've been on a few of those before. They're not fun, but build a lot of esprit de corps and kind of test what you're made of. So those are kind of the training areas that the Scouts went through, Russ, and just a kind of a brief rundown of what they did. So it wasn't necessarily that they were doing log PT or rappelling or airborne training like some of the Scouts had been through the Ranger course in Scotland. I think we're going to hear an audio clip from Alfred Jacobs, Carl Meyer, who went through commando training early in the war in the European theater and then came over and did the Scouts course. And he compared the two, and he said, the early Ranger training was tough. He said that was tough physically. He said, but the Scouts training was really tough too because of the waterborne aspect of it.
Alamo Scout training wasn't much different than commando training in England. We did the same type of training in the Pacific, except we didn't do log training, cliff climbing, and rappelling, things like that. The commando training was rougher, but the Alamo Scout training was rough too. It was good training. Although none of us were kept from our class after graduation, I went back and formed a 55-man INR platoon based on the same concept as the Alamo Scouts had. I did all the patrolling for the whole regiment and got a battlefield commission. In 1950, I was an armor officer at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea. I'm one of the chosen few also.
Kind of that's where we are. We have a lot of accounts of the Scouts going through the training. The field exercise part, a lot of guys could handle the basic skills and the calisthenics and the physical part. But what really set them apart, I think, was the field problems. They would be put on different teams and they would rotate, and how the personalities jived and how the leaders led.
Yeah, especially that last week. Like week 6 was a lot of going out, doing mock missions, and they would switch teams, get on different teams, see how they would react and everything, which basically was how they picked each other at the end of when they graduated, and you were selected to be on a operational, team. You got to pick who you wanted to be on the team. Mm-hmm. Okay, and you have a selection, and everything. It was kind of interesting how they did that. It was kind of like a democracy.
Well, Russ, interestingly, peer selection is something that really hadn't been done since the Civil War. So when you elect, hey, I want this guy to lead, I want the mayor to lead my regiment, or we'll make him a colonel and have him lead. Well, and I want this guy with me and this guy. It really hadn't worked out too well, but with the Scouts, I think it worked out very, very well. They had a chance to interact for 6 weeks with different guys, and I believe in the case of your father's team, they had been through training at Fort Pierce, I believe.
Yeah, they were. That's right. My father did not go to that, though.
I see.
The rest of them did, but he did not.
So they really kind of knew each other.
Yeah.
The core of the team.
Yeah, my father was a drill instructor at Fort Benning while the war was going on, and then he was sent over. So he didn't go to any kind of special, school before the Scouts.
Mm-hmm. Well, which is a testament to him for those guys to select him,
right? To
let them in their little group.
Yeah.
So, and I think that, as you alluded, that selection process, you don't have much time to win some people over.
Right.
And a lot of these guys, they came from the same unit, so they might be loyal to one officer or to their friends. And what you did is, and we might have an example of the ballot where you name the officer you would most like to go on a mission with behind enemy lines. Mm-hmm. And then the officers would be asked, which men would you like to lead on a mission behind enemy lines?
Yeah,
Which men would you trust?
I remember Bob Sumner telling me that he was in the same unit before the Scouts with Paul Jones. Okay.
Mhm.
And he was like, regardless, he was going to be on my team because this guy was able to find anything. If they needed a piece of equipment and they couldn't find it, he was the guy that could get it. So there was no way he was going to be put on another team.
Yeah, and I think every team needed those.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he was the guy.
Well, it's an interesting thing that Terry Santos, we talked about him in the previous episode.
Yeah,
as a member of the 4th class, and he intimated to me, and I think you may have been there when we had this conversation out in California. He was saying that Red Williams told him up front. He said, "There's no way you're going to be
right
on one of these teams."
Right, exactly. That was there.
And do you remember if Terry said why?
Because he was on that mock mission that ran into the Jap patrol.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking about that, and actually this is another story that concerns Red Williams. During Terry's class, they had a member from the Navy.
Right. Mm-hmm.
There might have been 2, but I know of one for sure who was the only member of the Navy to actually go through Alamo Scouts Training School.
Yeah.
And they went on a mission and something happened. Somebody stole somebody's knife and whatever. But we have an audio clip of Red Williams talking about that incident, and take a listen. I think it's good stuff.
Yeah. We sent a team out one time, and they stayed at a 5-day coastal watching station. The second day out, we sent an old scout out and told him to get something from their camp. He went out and climbed a mountainside in the dark, 300 feet, straight up a cliff, and stole a mesh kit knife. He brought it back to camp the next morning and reported back to our home base. When the week was over, the training team came in. They had an excellent supply report and hadn't missed a boat or a plane, but in their report, no one made a mention about the knife missing. When the meeting was over, I complimented them on the job they'd done. Then I brought the knife up in the air and brought it down and stuck it in the rostrum, and it quivered back and forth. You could have heard a pin drop. Then we found out what the truth was. They'd almost had a fight over it. One man accused another of taking his knife and losing his own. They finally quieted down and finished their job, but we sent that whole team home. Had it been a field mission and the knife was missing, a native could have found it and taken it back to his camp. And if they had been working for the Japanese, the scouts would have been done with. They should have left immediately after that knife was missing, but they didn't. Another man we sent home because he was too smart. We even had one Navy man who failed in the last week of the camp, and we had to send him home.
Okay, we're back. I think also that personnel, he actually didn't graduate, I think, but he had to sit. He was waiting for his ship, and he had to watch the graduation of the Alamo, of his teammates, that he trained with. That's sad,
Yeah, that's brutal.
That's brutal. But getting back to the training and selection, basically every night the staff would get together and go over all the names of the candidates, and pretty much every day the next morning they would eliminate candidates throughout the 6 weeks. So it was whittling down, little by little, getting down to the cream of the crop.
And, just like the Navy SEALs do today, if you want to ring the bell and say,
right.
You know what, I'm out, send me back, put me back on the front lines or put me back driving or whatever I did, and I'm not cut out for this. And
I think Jack Geiger talked about that they were told that if you want to bail out at any time, you could. It won't go against you. Yeah,
and you know what? Hey, and if if you bail out during that training, well, you know what? Then maybe you weren't cut out for that particular job anyway.
Yeah.
And hence that's why they did it. And I think that's one of the reasons so many of the elite forces have such a high standard in their training and in their conduct. And I hear many people say that, or heard many people say in my interviews, that Bradshaw never raised his voice. He never yelled. He never cussed. He just, he had this standard, and that's the way it was going to be. And Williams handled most of the discipline issues. Mm-hmm. And he said there weren't many, but when there was a discipline issue, then he acted as you heard from that description from Williams.
Yeah. Well, and I talked to a lot of the scouts, and I asked them about the language thing, and Bradshaw did not put up with people using swear words at all. You were not allowed to, And
and it's interesting in some of the literature that's out there about the Alamo Scouts, not written by me, by the way, is the narrative has a lot of them swearing and cussing, and that really wasn't the flavor I got.
No. When I talked to Harry Weiland, team member of my father, we had a long discussion on the phone about that, and he says we never dropped the F-bomb. You were not allowed to banter. Okay,
mm-hmm.
There was no bantering of each other, and because you're on a PT boat for 13 hours sometimes, going to Pagan Island, you don't want to get into a fight with your teammate, because I tell you what, Sumner would turn the boat around and go back.
The classic dad move, huh?
That's right. He said, "We're done. We're going back." And by the way, you two can go back to your regular unit. So that never happened.
Make me turn this 77-foot Elko boat around.
Exactly.
And take you back.
So, and basically what I've understood, and we'll talk about this when we talk about missions, is that the scouts were pretty quiet on those PT boats. They didn't talk much. We talked to a lot of the sailors that were crewmen on those boats, and they were very quiet throughout the whole trip to the islands and everything. So that's the
Navy guys, they wanted to hear the stories. And and one Filipino member of a team, they said they'd taken a prisoner, and they was having a cigarette with the prisoner, and the scout was sitting there, and he said something to the effect of, "If it was up to me, I would have killed you there."
Right.
I wouldn't have brought you back if we had orders.
He had orders too.
He said hardly a word, but he said that's the one time that's the only thing that scout said on the way back from that mission.
Yeah.
If it was up to me, I would have killed you there.
Right. Yeah. One of the things the sailors always said was that we drop them off to go on the island. We never expected them to return.
Yeah.
But they did.
Mm-hmm. And again, to come full circle, Russ, I think that is a testament to the whole process.
Yeah.
So number one, having a clear idea of what your mission is. Number two, the selection process of seeking volunteers and qualified people to begin with. Having a clear-cut idea of the training that is mission and area specific, and then staying in your lane. I think those elements made for such a successful unit. And you can look at Darby's Rangers in Europe. They were formed for this specific purpose, but they were misused as infantry. Merrill's Marauders, misused as infantry. The Devil's Brigade, misused. So I think one thing that the Scouts had is they had a very clear idea of what their mission was, and the training was kind of molded around that specific mission. and you start with great men and you train to that need, and you don't allow them to be used in the wrong way. Just skipping ahead a little bit, the Scouts, a couple teams were in New Guinea during the Hollandia landings, and they were attached to an infantry unit, and they kept saying, we need to do this, that, and the other thing. And this colonel said, I'm going to have you court-martialed. And they said, well, court-martial us. You're not going to use us as infantry. And it was actually a call to Bradshaw, who got him out of being court-martialed by an infantry colonel, because he wanted to use them in a certain way. And he said, we are not infantry. We have a specific mission, is to reconnoiter and collect information and send it back to be used as intelligence, to develop.
Yeah, I think Lieutenant Sumner had a problem with a commander.
I think a lot of them did, actually.
Yeah, he talked about that. I think it was on the Omagh mission, which was a pretty long mission. It was I don't know how many days it was, but it was quite long. And when they got to the point where they met up with an infantry unit, their commander was, like, okay, you're going to follow my orders. And he's like, no, And
I think that reverts back, Russ, to this reluctance or misunderstanding of
what they did.
Special elite units. And at the time, it wasn't really, or they weren't really accepted. And I think, who are you again? Never heard of you. Well, the Scouts were secret, top secret for a long time. So, I'm not going to, a 22-year-old or 23-year-old second lieutenant is going to tell me you need this and this and this and this. No.
Yeah. Well, and they had the Kruger card, which kind of validated everything. Yeah.
Let me make a call.
Yeah, and
I'll be right back.
We'll get into the Kruger card in a future episode.
Absolutely. And do we still have one, or is it at the museum in Norfolk?
We have one in Norfolk, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we probably dig up a picture of that somewhere.
Oh, yeah. I believe the one in Norfolk is Lieutenant Nellis's card, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very good. So all right, Russ, what do we have next on the ways of training? Anything you can think of?
We covered a lot. Let's talk about, let's bring on our sponsor. Let's roll that.
Absolutely. Let's hear from Slow Hand. So barbecue sounds good about right now, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
All righty.
Okay. Hey, welcome back. If you're interested in sponsoring the WRB podcast, please leave a comment below, and we'll get in touch with you and see what we can do. Get you on the podcast. Okay. Right now, we're going to talk to Lance again about we have a audio clip and about the graduation and the training. So tell us about it, Lance.
Okay. Well, we're going to hear from Alfred Jacobs and his take on the ceremony. Not a lot of the Scouts talked about that, and essentially everyone who graduated got a diploma, and we'll have an example that we'll show you of a nice diploma. And from that point, you were either accepted into a team or you were returned to your unit and to conduct similar reconnaissance duties and functions and or training at the company or regimental or battalion level, whatever, wherever you went back to. And in some cases, men were charged with training their entire reconnaissance unit. Sometimes a 55-man reconnaissance unit would be trained by scouts coming back with that extra knowledge. So for many men, it was understandably, it was a letdown if they weren't selected for one reason or the other. And I alluded to that earlier or in a previous episode, Russ, if you recall, the needs of the Army, the needs of the Alamo Scouts, any upcoming operations that they might have manpower needs for, peer review, peer selection, and cadre grading. That was one element into it. If they were deemed to be not quite to the level of the others, still enough to graduate, but really not what they wanted for an operational team, then they were not retained. Those who were retained had the option of staying with a team or returning to their unit. And I will add, some men were sent to Alamo Scout training through the War Department with no intention of having them remain as scouts. Some who had served in Europe, were sent over by the War Department to undergo the training and return to the War Department. So it just was not a exclusively to become on an operational team. And I'd written an article before about the Netherlands East Indies Intelligence Service, who sent a number of their operatives during the 4th class to train with Alamo Scouts so they could have a better understanding of some of the advanced reconnaissance techniques used by 6th Army there on New Guinea. So it just was not to be on an operational team. So that was the primary focus.
All right, let's play the clip.
All righty.
In fact, I think it was probably like announced that we didn't have reveille or anything because we were in a combat situation. I think it was just kind of spread around by the squad leaders, that this scouting outfit was looking for volunteers, if I remember right, was the way I heard about it. And of course, then, after you got to interview and got to, then you heard of them then once it was brought up. But there was not that much information on them at that time. Well, as I remember, this was done from a company formation or whatever. Congratulated you on finishing your training, and handed you, they had 2 types of diplomas. One that you were qualified and one that you were accepted as a scout and would be, could continue on with the scouts. And the other one, you were just qualified, but they didn't keep you because out of the 5 squads that were left, they only kept like 10 people, maybe 15. I don't remember the numbers now. And of course, if you had indicated that you were not going to stay, I think they just gave you a qualified diploma and sent you back. If you more or less volunteered not to stay, which I had, because I remember right, they wanted to know before we graduated, which if anybody that did not want, if they were accepted, did not want to stay. So that I suppose, if they happened to pick, 2 teams and 5 of the guys they picked were ones that wasn't going to stay as scouts after they'd finished it, then they'd have to go back through the selection process again, picking the guys. So I think that was the reason they basically wanted to know whether you would stay if you were selected as a working scout.
All right, we're back from hearing that clip. I think we're done for episode 3, and episode 4 is we're going to start talking about missions. We're going to talk about the first Alamo Scout mission, and
absolutely,
exciting.
Russ. And I think of a sergeant major that I had in Korea. He was the INSCOM sergeant major, and he said, I hear a whole lot of puckering, but not much kissing. Well, we're going to finally get on to the kissing.
Yeah.
And the missions. And this one's of immense importance, and that would be McGowan mission in February of 1944. So I look forward to sharing some of the highlights of that mission and some
we
great photos.
We actually have footage from the archives, not of the mission, but they went back to recreate the mission for a newsreel.
dug up by mine and yours truly.
Yeah, it was a lot of work to find. So
yes, it was.
So anyway, well, we want to thank you for being with us on episode 3, and we will catch you on episode 4 in a few weeks. Thank you for watching.
See you soon.
All right, see you.